At the main residence of the Jiggle family in Hubei province, chaos reigned supreme. The once pristine halls were now smeared with blood, and lifeless bodies lay scattered across the grounds like discarded remnants of a broken dream. Amid this gruesome carnage, a lone figure sat amidst the destruction, savoring his liquor as though the macabre scene was merely a backdrop for his indulgence. His body, drenched in blood that was not his own, told a tale of violent conquest, while his demeanor exuded an unsettling calm, as though such devastation was nothing out of the ordinary. His blood-streaked face bore a twisted smile, one that mocked the futility of resistance and the fleeting nature of safety in the Central Plains. Even the sanctity of Wudong's territory seemed trivial under his contemptuous gaze. A subordinate knelt before him. The words carried weight, detailing rumors of the Black Death Alliance leader's demise. The whispers of the Tang family's involvement were sharp, painting a vivid picture of an individual who wielded mastery over poison, hidden weapons, and the elusive art of swordsmanship. Sword force, a mark of a martial artist of extraordinary caliber, was said to have been their weapon of triumph. Jung-hyuk, the leader known as the Heaven's Brilliance Demon Lord, sat in contemplative silence, his blood-soaked form exuding a quiet menace. The news of the Black Death Alliance leader's death had stirred a mix of intrigue and disdain within him. For someone capable of wielding sword force, defeating such an opponent required remarkable skill, perhaps even the kind of mastery he himself possessed. Still, doubt clouded his mind. Was it possible he had overestimated the Alliance leader's strength? Rising from his seat, Jung-hyuk moved with deliberate calm, his bloodied robes trailing like shadows behind him. The death of the Alliance leader, he concluded, was a pathetic end for someone once so formidable. It almost disappointed him that he hadn't been the one to deliver the fatal blow. Yet, in his twisted logic, the outcome still served his purpose. With one less obstacle standing in his path, he could now return his focus to the task at hand, eliminating the remnants of those he deemed unworthy. Passing his kneeling subordinate, he demanded further updates, his tone sharp and expectant. The subordinate, head bowed low, quickly provided the information he sought. The Myeong clan's whereabouts had been confirmed. Their power was steadily growing under the guise of a merchant guild. As Jung-hyuk absorbed this information, a subtle tension rippled through the air. His subordinate, sensing an unfamiliar presence drawing near, stiffened. The unspoken warning was clear. A potential threat was approaching. Jung-hyuk stood motionless, his bloodied form blending into the chaotic remnants of the Jiggle residence. His gaze narrowed, fixed on the distant presence closing in with surprising speed. A faint smirk crept onto his face, betraying a mix of amusement and disdain. The aura was unmistakable, a disciplined and deliberate energy, reminiscent of the Wudong sect. The leader's composure remained unshaken as he contemplated the irony of their sudden swiftness, contrasting it with their usual measured, almost sluggish nature. Despite the subtle mockery in his expression, his eyes glinted with a sharp intensity. Turning to his subordinate, Jung-hyuk issued his orders with a chilling calm. There was no room for hesitation or doubt in his tone. The Myeong clan's movements were a priority, their growing strength a potential thorn in his side. Delegating their eradication was a matter of strategy, but dealing with the approaching presence was something he chose to handle personally. Jung-hyuk stood beneath the vast expanse of the night sky, his blood-soaked figure illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. Jung-hyuk's eyes burned with a fierce intensity, as if addressing an unseen presence far beyond mortal reach. This moment was more than a declaration. It was a vow etched into the fabric of the darkness around him, a herald of the world he sought to bring forth. Under the vast expanse of the starry night, the Tang clan's training ground stood quiet, save for the rhythmic sound of Yeonjeong's labored breaths. She was a figure of determination, her every movement strained, her body trembling as though on the verge of collapse. Sweat dripped from her brow, mixing with the dust beneath her feet as she pressed herself to the limit. The weight of the moment settled heavily in her mind. Her thoughts drifted back to the Sichuan assembly, where she had been nothing but a helpless observer. The helplessness she had felt, watching as events unfolded beyond her control, haunted her. It was an experience she could never allow to repeat itself. The bitter taste of impotence still lingered in her mind, fueling a fire within her that refused to be extinguished. With a fierce determination, she pushed forward, ignoring the screaming protests of her body. There was no turning back now. The technique she was mastering had been hard-earned, secured through a painstaking negotiation that had tested her resolve. Just one more time, she thought, as she steeled herself to continue. The pain, the strain, it didn't matter. This time, she would succeed. The quiet intensity of the Tang clan training ground was disrupted by the sudden appearance of Jae-gal Changsik. His steps were purposeful, yet there was an uncharacteristic weight to his presence. Yeon-Myeong, engrossed in her grueling practice, was startled as she turned to face him. Her expression shifted from surprise to curiosity, tinged with concern. She hadn't expected him, especially after he had mentioned his demanding schedule earlier that day. Changsik's face was pale, his usual composed demeanor replaced with an almost somber air. His eyes, heavy with unspoken emotions, met Yeon-Myeong's as he called her name. The tone of his voice carried an unshakable gravity, and she could sense that something was amiss. Despite the growing tension in her chest, she forced herself to remain calm, though her voice betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. He hesitated, his gaze faltering momentarily as though searching for the right words. Then, with visible effort, he began to speak. The regret in his tone was palpable, and his shoulders seemed to carry an unseen burden. When he finally delivered the news, his voice was laced with sorrow he could barely conceal. The Jegal family's main house in Hubei had been annihilated. The words hung in the air like a blade poised to strike, their weight slicing through the fragile calm. Yeon-Myeong stood frozen, her mind racing to process the devastating revelation. The ground beneath her felt unsteady as the enormity of the loss washed over her. This was no ordinary news. It was the destruction of everything her family had built, everything they stood for. Yun Jung-hyuk, the heaven's brilliance demon lord, had returned, his resurgence plunging Hubei province into chaos. Known for his merciless power, he had already annihilated 3 of the 5 great families, leaving the martial world trembling in fear. With his reappearance, the balance of power in the region was shattered, and the Jegal family became the next target of his wrath. Amid this upheaval, Wudong's swordmaster and their elite swordsmen mobilized to intercept Magwangshan, a ferocious warrior loyal to Jung-hyuk, who spearheaded the assault on the Jegal family. Their intervention was swift, but the battle that ensued was devastating. Wudong's forces, renowned for their discipline and skill, found themselves utterly outmatched. The remnants of Wudong's strength could do little more than watch helplessly as Magwangshan and his forces completed their brutal task. The Jegal family's main house, a symbol of their legacy and influence, was systematically wiped out. Yeon-Myeong sat silently, his gaze fixed on the report before him, his expression heavy with contemplation. The details laid out in stark, unforgiving words painted a grim picture of devastation. As his thoughts churned, a question weighed heavily on his mind. How could no one stand against the heaven's brilliance demon lord? Across from him stood Jae-gal Changsik and Yeon-Myeong, their presence a reminder of the fragile line between survival and extinction. Yeon-Myeong acknowledged the news from Hubei with a composed exterior, though the gravity of the situation was not lost on him. Changsik, however, could no longer maintain his composure. His face was etched with sorrow, and his voice trembled as he spoke. His words carried the weight of profound grief and reluctant gratitude. Yeon-Myeong's decision to remain rather than flee from the Black Death Alliance had, in hindsight, been their salvation. Had they attempted to escape that day, they would have met the same fate as the Jegal family, utterly decimated by Magwangshan's relentless assault. Yet, even with their survival, the pain of loss was unbearable. Changsik's shoulders shook as tears streamed down his face. The realization that their family, once proud and formidable, now no longer existed under the heavens was a wound too deep to bear. His trembling voice cracked under the weight of his emotions as he apologized for his perceived disgrace, though his anguish was a sentiment shared by all. Steady and calm, carrying a sense of purpose that steadied the grief-stricken air around him, Yeon-Myeong's gaze lingered on Jae-gal Changsik and Yeon-Myeong. He spoke not of despair but of resilience, reminding them that not all had been lost. Though the Jegal family's ancestral home lay in ruins and their lineage had suffered an immeasurable blow, there were survivors, members who had found sanctuary within the Tang family. That alone was a foundation, a thread from which to weave their legacy anew. Yeon-Myeong reassured them of his unwavering commitment to fulfilling the promise he had made to those who sought refuge and trusted him. He vowed to help them rebuild, to restore the Jeagle family with the strength and resolve they still carried in their hearts. As the weight of his words settled, Yeon-Myeong's thoughts turned inward, his mind churning with questions about the tumultuous movements unfolding across the martial world. He realized the importance of preparation, both for the Tang family and the remnants of the Jeagle clan under its protection. There was no time to linger in sorrow. The tide of conflict would reach them eventually. Resolving to strengthen their position and fortify their defenses, Yeon-Myeong began to formulate plans. A subordinate stepped in, bowing respectfully before Yeon-Myeong. His presence was an interruption, but not unwelcome. Yeon-Myeong's eyes briefly flickered toward him, still deep in thought about the gravity of the situation. The news from Hubei, the fallen Jeagle family, the uncertain future, all weighed heavily on his mind. Upon hearing the report that a guest from the Wudong sect had arrived, a flicker of concern passed over Yeon-Myeong's face. The Wudong sect was not a faction to be taken lightly, and the timing of their visit struck him as curious. The already volatile situation had only intensified with the destruction of the Jeagle family and the looming threat of Jung-hyuk's power. The last thing they needed now was another unpredictable force entering the fray. After a moment of contemplation, Yeon-Myeong gave a brief but decisive order for the guests to be allowed in. Turning his attention to Yeonjeong and Changsik, he saw the lingering sorrow on their faces. With a voice tempered by compassion yet firm, he directed them to rest, understanding that their grief was still fresh. Their loss was profound, but he knew their involvement would not be necessary for this meeting. It was a matter he needed to handle himself, to listen and weigh whatever the Wudong visitor had to say. As the room emptied, Yeon-Myeong sat in quiet anticipation, the stillness amplifying his thoughts. A guest from Wudong, he mused, but are they here as an ally or a troublemaker? The visitor, a man named Chong Yoon, entered the room with a bow, his posture formal yet purposeful. He spoke of the chaos consuming Hubei, the rise of the Heaven's Brilliance Demon Lord, and the fall of the Jeagle and Myeong families. His purpose was clear. He sought the Tang family's support to fight back against this growing darkness. Yeon-Myeong sat calmly at his desk, flipping through a report, seemingly unfazed by the visitor's words. The mention of the Heaven's Brilliance Demon Lord did not stir him, and he responded with a detached air, his thoughts elsewhere. The chaos unfolding in Hubei, the devastation of once powerful families. It all felt distant, a storm raging in another world. Chong Yoon, undeterred, continued his plea. He painted a grim picture of the current situation, mentioning the Tang family's victory over the Black Death Alliance as a beacon of hope. As a martial artist of the righteous sex, he implored Yeon-Myeong to use his strength for the greater good and join the effort to eliminate the Demon Lord. But Yeon-Myeong's reaction was swift, almost dismissive. His gaze never left the report before him as he heard Chong Yoon's appeal. There was no hint of empathy or interest in his response. The words of someone pleading for help seemed to carry little weight in his mind, their desperation falling flat. Yeon-Myeong's cold refusal was absolute. He had no intention of aligning himself with anyone who came seeking aid, especially not with the self-righteous tone Chong Yoon carried. Chong Yoon's eyes widened in surprise at Yeon-Myeong's cold and dismissive response. The unexpected refusal, delivered with such finality, caught him off guard. He had hoped to appeal to the family's sense of vengeance, to remind them of their deep-seated principles. But instead of finding common ground, he was met with a sharp rebuke that stung more deeply than he anticipated. Yeon-Myeong's tone shifted to something darker, a warning that reverberated in the room like the low growl of a predator. His words, carefully measured but laden with disdain, cut through the air. He reminded Chong Yoon of the Wudong sect's inaction when the Tang family was annihilated. The mention of Wudong's failure to protect the Jeagle family, a family that had once been an ally, was the final straw. Yeon-Myeong's anger flared as he recalled the moment the Wudong sect stood by, offering no assistance while the Tang family suffered. To have Chong Yoon, a member of that very sect, now invoke the Tang family's principles seemed almost absurd. His voice grew colder as he pressed the matter. He wasn't just refusing help. He was condemning the very hypocrisy that had allowed so many to suffer in silence. Chong Yoon stood there, unable to respond. The weight of Yeon-Myeong's words sank in, and the reality of his failure became all too clear. The fire in his chest, once fueled by righteous conviction, flickered and dimmed in the face of such overwhelming truth. his head lowered, a slight tremor in his hands betraying his inner turmoil.